I would like to thank the Chesterton Club for inviting me. I'm not an expert on Chesterton. That leads me to presume I was only invited because of my incredibly good looks. And the fact that some of you are laughing leads me to believe that I might be on the wrong track there too. I'm not an expert on Chesterton, but when I was young, a student, I had the great privilege to study at an international institute, which opened up to me a new library. Back in the day, before the internet, that's how you got books, how you got knowledge, how you discovered something. Is you entered the library, and then, because you couldn't read everything, you just browsed through the shelves, and you tried to, by staying close in some mystical fashion, absorb the knowledge from the shelves by some process that is similar to osmosis, I imagine. But among these shelves, there was one shelf, a bottom shelf in the entrance hall, that had the complete works of Chesterton. And as I was, from Ignatius Press, and as I was moving along this shelf, my eye caught the cover of volume 1, on which it was written in big letters, heretics. And I was immediately intrigued, because as a Catholic I knew that I could either try my entire life to become a saint, or if that was going to prove too difficult, I could at least tell everyone else who got it wrong that they got it wrong. So I tried really to get my grip on heresies and what they were, and I opened the book, and there were all these names I'd never heard of. Who was Kipling, and who were all these other men? But one of the first sentences that I read made me fall in love with Chesterton, and it was about a man, Mr. George Bernard Shaw, a man whose philosophy is quite solid, quite coherent, and quite wrong. And I was standing there laughing, which is not a thing you should do in a library, because... But I immediately went to the priest who had the office next door and said, read this is amazing, this is wonderful. I just read one sentence. But that was the beginning of my love affair with Chesterton, because of his incredible style of writing, this humor. I mean, here you have a perfect anatomy of a joke. A joke really is constructed by having, you have a build-up, you build up an expectation, and then you invert the expectation. You have something that subverts the thing that people expect, and that's what makes them laugh. So I discovered Chesterton, I fell in love with Chesterton, I read Chesterton every time, every hour I could. This is really saying too much, because I only got to read a few of the books, but I've always, and I keep going back to them. I have them as audiobooks that I listen to when I go to the woods, and people think me mad because I go like, but you know, most of the deer and the wild boar don't care, so those few humans that see me must think whatever they think. So I thought, I didn't really know, when I was invited here, I didn't know what to speak on or what to speak about, because you know, I don't have a wealth of knowledge. But there was something that I'd previously, a week prior to being asked to come here, I had read in Orthodoxy, in my 7th iteration of reading Orthodoxy. I still have this joy of discovering these incredibly dense and beautifully formulated truths that you all love about Chesterton, I imagine, as much as I do. And so, the title, of course, Chesterton on Recycling Beer Cans, is a title, because I knew that recycling beer cans was so dear to the Croatian people that I thought they would all flock to this talk, because it was about a beer can, or beer maybe at least. But really the question that I want to illustrate or shed light on through Chesterton's thought is one that is a key question that whenever you open a website, a news website, when you watch TV, or whatever people do these days, I don't know, I live in mountains, but and the goats are just saying, oh, but there was a sheep, so anyway. But the question, of course, the big question is environmentalism. And environmentalism, I have a lot of friends in the US, it can be a very polarizing issue. It might be something where you have ideologies that you encounter that conflict with a Catholic view of the world. And as always, Chesterton has this brilliant passage in Orthodoxy, in chapter 7, that we will also, I'm going to give you a listen to it, because I will not read it out loud, it will be like Chesterton with Schwarzenegger, English feel, which is brutal. And so I'm going to have an excerpt from that later. But to understand Chesterton's answer, I thought it would be interesting to look at environmentalism, its history, the main currents, the main ideologies that come from it. And so I thought, okay, where do we get the history of environmentalism? There, of course, I don't know, is there a Green Party in Croatia? No, yes. Well, there are conflicting opinions on, well, there may be 3 people. Okay. Anton makes like this, so very small. Very good. Well, in many other countries you have these movements that came from the 60s into the 70s. They formed into political parties in the 80s. But I thought I'm going to look at an organization and the way they portray their own history that is probably universal or that exists in most places, and that is Greenpeace, which in Croatian is called Greenpeace, I imagine, because they're called Greenpeace everywhere. So we're going to look at the roots of environmentalism, looking at the history that Greenpeace provides. We're going to look at the resulting ideological positions that you can sort of abstract from these roots. And we see the problems that Chesterton saw 100 years ago, and we will look at Chesterton's view and resolution so that we understand what a Catholic environmentalism would look like. All right, the roots according to Greenpeace. And this is maybe small text. Well, you could move up. No, yeah. So there's an early phase. So when you look at the website of Greenpeace, you actually get a presentation of the history of environmentalism. And so they mention a few early instances of environmentalism. They don't claim that necessarily they come from these instances, but they mention them as a sort of an environmentally conscious behavior of man towards nature. So they mention the oldest written sacred texts, the Vedic sages that speak of sacred forests. Of course, they mention Buddha and his compassion for all sentient beings. They mention the Gilgamesh epos from the Mesopotamian region, where Gilgamesh wants to cut down all the trees and then is punished by the gods for this thought. You have something similar in the Greek myths. You have Orion, who loved hunting after a trip to Chios, and he was introduced by Artemis and her mother to hunting, and then he wanted to kill every animal, for which he was then killed by an arrow or a poisonous scorpion, depending on which legend you follow, by the goddess of the earth, who would not have every animal killed. All these are given as instances of man and his impact on environment and religious answers. There are more recent ones, such as the Vishnoi sect from the 1700s. This is an Indian group who believed in the sacredness of trees. And they were the first ones who chained themselves to trees to prevent them from being cut down. The northwest of India is very dry, Rajasthan and these places, so more desert feel. So trees are important, and so you must not cut down the living trees. You have these Vishnoi sect. But they also mention other things, such as the water problems that already the early civilizations along the fruitful rivers in India had, the Indus River civilizations that had to deal with sanitation issues and the disease that would come from it. They mention Greek deforestation that is already lamented by authors of antiquity, including Greek doctors speaking about the ill effects of mining, copper mining, and how the effects it has on the human body and what will be adequate treatments. You have an English example, Edward I, who forbade the burning of coal in 1306 because there was so much smog in London even then that for a period they had to find some other solution. If you look at these instances of environmentalism, and being the bright minds that you are, you can discern 2 groups, right? There is one that has a religious connotation, which either derives from a pantheistic, a holistic view of the universe where everything is one in some way, or everything might be divine in some way. Or you have what I would call anthropocentric environmentalism. That is, anthropocentric means centering around man and his problems and trying to find a solution. So if, for example, I mean, we all have an impact on our surroundings. And so if I walk over the grass is flat, it can't be cut down by the farmer 10 minutes later. He has to wait 2 days until it gets up again. So we have an impact on things, and if this impact is negative, it influences our decision-making on how to best fruitfully live our existence. So this would be an anthropocentric environmentalism. It has not really an ideological basis, but it's just an observation of things that happen and things that we react to consequently. These two groups, the sort of a religious connotation that goes into a pantheistic view and the anthropocentric view, they come back in the modern era. But the modern era has a peculiar intensification of the situation, because we have, first in the modern era, we have the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution which really begins with the Copernican revolution, the change of the heliocentric model replacing the geocentric model. So having the Earth not being the center anymore, there begins a shift that would, over centuries, lead to different philosophical arguments that, for example, said that man was not special. So you get authors at the end of the scientific revolution, such as Jeremy Bentham, who objects to human exceptionalism, the fact that humans are special, by saying, well, they are sentient beings and I can't really see any other value in them that is far greater. So if we protect humans, then we have to protect all sentient beings. So he was one of the first advocates of animal rights. Of course, from the scientific revolution, which brought thinkers into a mechanistic worldview, where you have Descartes and you have Francis Bacon, authors, not Roger Bacon, who was a Franciscan, but Francis Bacon. You have philosophers who look at the world as a mechanistic thing. And so if you try to maximize your benefit from it, then you have to understand the mechanisms of the world, and then you can exploit them. You can use them to maximize your profit, you maximize human well-being, or whatever you consider to be the goal and the object of what you do. But you have a mechanistic, materialistic view of the universe, which, as the scientific revolution progresses, in philosophy takes more and more hold. And that is, of course, the precondition for an industrial revolution, which, together with a capitalism gone further and further, means that you have a completely new situation on the hand. You have man dominating nature, you have man dominating man. If you look at Manchester capitalism, if you look at the capitalism of the 19th century or even before, you have the mines, you have people living in very, very difficult conditions. But this is all under the context of a scientific revolution which views man differently, which views the world differently and society differently. So these are the two currents in the modern era that shape man's relationship to the environment. And so you get, because of the effects, some of which are positive and some of which are negative, you get, again, an environmental push, an environmental movement. And the first is similar to the cases that we discussed from the early period. It's an anthropocentric reaction. So you have a concrete problem that comes from it. The drinking water is no longer drinking water, so you have to come up with a solution. You do it because you have a problem, and then you find a solution. You have people who consider resources. You have Thomas Malthus, who was the first one who coined well, maybe not the first one, but he was one of the first who talked about overpopulation, which he believed was going to come much sooner, and the resources were already far too short. But he observed, he was a cleric from England, and he thought, okay, so we have to look at resources, and there is a certain growth, and that leads to a certain poverty, and then there is a certain catastrophe, almost inevitable, because of certain mechanisms that come. But Greenpeace obviously puts that in the history, because overpopulation continued to be a popular theme in the 20th century, with incredible prophecies, most of which we have learned didn't come true. You have others that could be considered in that direction of an anthropocentric reaction. You have George Perkins, who wrote Man and Nature, who speaks of the pillaging and the destruction of nature and the problems associated with it. You have Rachel Carson, an example from the 20th century, very influential for the immediate beginning of the green movement in the United States, she wrote the book Silent Spring, which is on the pesticide DDT, which killed off a lot of bugs, some of which was beneficial, like malaria and other things, but it also had a lot of effects on humans in terms of the problems, health problems that are associated with it. So she wrote a book and she led the revolution against DDT, and that was at that time was not a green movement in a sense that it was partisan, there was some ideological fringe. That was a people's movement. In fact, the very first strong political decisions that were taken in the United States were taken by Nixon, who was a Republican of Watergate fame, but he did other things as well. So the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, these things were enacted as a fruit from this consciousness of the way we relate to the environment. That DDT was a catalyst for this movement. So there's an anthropocentric reaction throughout the centuries that parallel the scientific and industrial revolution. But there's also another reaction, which is more ideological, and it's called, I'm calling it the romantic reaction, which basically means that a lot of people went, ah. The romantic period is a period that follows at the heels of this rationalistic approach in the 18th century. You have that culminates in the French Revolution, and there's a yearning for something deeper. There's a lot of sentimentalism, nationalism is on the rise. There are a lot of things. Chesterton, in some ways, is a romantic, but not only that. He speaks of romance a lot, which is different than the bland romanticism that a lot of romantics follow. But there are some when you read Chesterton, even in beautiful books such as my favorite book that I'm going to advertise, and if you haven't read it, By the Pain of Sin, I Command You. No, I can't. If I was Pope, I would not. It doesn't work either. Anyway, you should read St. Francis of Assisi. And if you read St. Francis of Assisi, the introductory chapter, you get a beautiful view of civilization, very much like in Everlasting Man, and the way the story of it, the story of God and His creation, the beautiful insights that obviously are not done, they don't come from a rationalistic impulse, but from a romantic impulse that sees the deeper truth of it. But the romantic reaction that we find in the environmental movement is one that borrows more from the previous pantheistic school of thought, from Indian philosophy. We get Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is famous. He bases himself, I'm not going into the philosophical roots. If you Kant, German philosopher, what can I say? So horrible. But he had nice hair. So anyway, well, a wig. Anyway, so Kant, of course, Kant is trying to build a bridge between the empiricism that has destroyed metaphysics and rationalism, which is the only, one way of founding of metaphysics. He tries to sort of find a bridge. He looks at the a priori things of how we know and understand, and this is where some people then see German idealism takes its genesis from there. But also there's a current called transcendentalism, American transcendentalism, which sort of it goes beyond this, is from an American movement, philosophical movement, of which Ralph Waldo Emerson is the first and chief proponent. Not the only one, there are other philosophers. But the idea here is a fundamental goodness of nature and of man, something that is already taken in from Rousseau, who came previously, and who had similar ideas. So there's no concept of original sin. There's a goodness of nature, a goodness of man. And so if you see something bad, who brought it? Man brought it in some way. Society brought it. Systems, structures, and other things brought it. So there's a romantic movement that leads out into the woods, something which some of this the people of this movement actually did. Henry David Thoreau wrote Walden, a very influential work in 1854, who advocated a simple life. So there was a romantic idea of going and living by yourself. He was actually really by himself for 2 years in the woods and trying to live off nature, but not in a dominating way, but in a receptive way, as it were. There are romantics such as John Muir. If there are any people, I think the introduction included the fact that I walk a lot. So for people who walk a lot, John Muir is known because he founded and he is instrumental in the establishment of national parks in the US, Yosemite and other places. There's a John Muir Trail through the high Sierras, Sierra Nevada in California. So you have, again, someone who said, I don't need a church because the trees, the forests and the mountains are my cathedral where I worship. You have something where these authors, these members of this movement see themselves as part of a greater whole in which man is a particle. Emerson, for example, spoke when he went into nature, he sensed himself to be a particle of God, one with everything else. And so there's with Emerson, he was more of an armchair going out into the woods. He was a theorist. John Muir was the one who really went out there to live in this environment. So you have a romantic reaction that leans towards pantheism and leans towards the goodness of man, the goodness of nature, and therefore, of course, develops an ethic that is based on this goodness of man and goodness of nature. So there is conservationism, there is the idea that man is really a destructive force, and if he is a destructive force, he ought to be removed from the environment. He's not a member of these things, but he's one that ought to be removed. So we get to ideological positions that come from this modern period that have mainly fall into two more of the extreme groups. And the first one is one of exploitation, of domination. It's the school of Descartes, it's the school of Bacon. Man is the possessor of nature. It's a materialist, atheist perception of the world, and therefore if you can control nature, if you have the power to do so, it's about this power and acquiring this power. You do what you do you with that power. You have a technocratic understanding of things, so technology will solve all the problems and difficulties that exist. You might have a current that goes into in this idea of domination that goes in the Nietzschean vein of Superman and another Superman, and they fight it out to become the super-duper man. Yes, it goes. You have a moralist, a moral relativism, and of course you have gaining as a principle also because it coincides with certain theories. There's something such as a social Darwinist theory. You have an ultra-capitalist theory where you have the strong, you have the weak, and it all takes care through these mechanisms. So this will be one direction in which things can lean based on the scientific, the industrial revolution, and a particular conception of man which began with this. Obviously people critique this, but not only Catholics critiqued it, but there was also, of course, from this more romantic view, one that has I'm calling it neo-pantheism, so this idea of being part of one greater whole. And you have a mother nature, this is a typical vocabulary. We speak of nature as if it had an agency, if it was, nowadays sometimes the new agey people go more like the universe provides. This language of ascribing intentional action to nature, as I mentioned. A lot of this is connected to sentimentalism. It usually has this anti-exceptionalist attitude, which coincides with a misanthropic tendency. So if man is not special, nature and man is good, at least man in nature is good, then society, industrial processes, or anything like are destructive, are a problem. And therefore you get cartoons like this. Haven't ever heard of waste prevention? Here you have a nice family where the children are depicted as garbage bags. Why? If you look at the current debate on carbon, the carbon footprint, of course there are people saying you should get a Tesla, or you should get this and this, and other people say, well, it's not going to really help that much, but then the people are saying you shouldn't have children, because every child you have is going to have a huge carbon footprint in growing, and then buying not a Tesla, but some other car, or whatever you will. So a view of man where man is the problem. You might know this cartoon, which is far more famous, You see Dr. Universe treating the patient Earth. I don't know if you can't read it. This is not so good. Your child is suffering from an excess of greenhouse gases and is running a fever. It would seem he has a bad case of human infestation. And the son, look at the poor son. They can be difficult to get rid of. Get him to take 2 asteroid impacts, then call me in a millennium. What a wonderful, wonderful, joyous cartoon. But it's misanthropic. It looks at man as a problem, as someone who is really a cancerous thing. And this used to be sort of on the fringe. If you go to certain kind of protestation marches or something, you would find something similar in a banner. But you know Planet Earth by BBC, this beautiful nature documentary? David Attenborough, who narrates this, recently spoke of humanity as a virus. So you get this idea that man is the problem. Not certain actions of man are a problem, but man really is the disease, even though with some qualifications, maybe that's what some of these people mean. But there's sort of a misanthropic, anti-human tendency that goes along with it. This current is anti-capitalist, as it in many ways is born out of this critique of the industrial age and the capitalism which wrought havoc. You have companies who for profit ruin the environment, the livability of a space. You have mines digging up everything, contaminating drinking water, and populations then in poorer countries suffering. So you have the response here is not, as it should be, distributism, but it is anti-capitalism in its crudest form, usually tending towards a Marxist leftist ideology. Very often other ways to view the human person, a constructivist perspective on man, certain feminist ideologies that are based on Marxist ideologies come to the foreground. So all of this is sort of the other direction in which things can go. And we can see that both of these views are incompatible with a Christian understanding of things. And yet they don't come in a vacuum, they're not made up necessarily. Some of the prophecies might be wrong. Some of the problems, however, are real in terms of pollution. If you look at our electronic waste, we all have nice phones, but when the phones go to die, with most men it's very simple, we put them in a drawer where they remain for the next 100 years. But if you actually throw them out, they very often travel to poorer countries where people then have to deal with our electronics, because there are some people who make a profit by exporting the waste. They're not recycling it because the laws there don't stipulate it, and so problems are created for people who live in these places. So it's clear there's a reaction, and it's clear there are problems, and there is a cause for an anthropocentric environmentalism which doesn't have a particular ideological affiliation. So you basically have to deal with data. You might get the data and the interpretation of the data right or wrong, but sort of to look at the way we live and the problems that we are generating by just closing our eyes and saying, no, it doesn't exist. It will continue to exist. But our way can't be the way to justify that state of affairs by exploitation and saying, this is what we are meant to do, we're going to move on to the next planet when we're done with this one here. And the other option for us is not really open either, that we sort of romanticize nature, believe nature to be our mother, and therefore we are almost bad children who have to chastise ourselves and get rid of ourselves to save Mother Earth. That would be sort of the other extreme in which it goes. And obviously, the man, the philosopher of common sense, the man who has an answer, a beautiful answer, is Chesterton. And I'm going to play an excerpt from this passage from Orthodoxy, read by David Grizzly Smith in by the way, a Creative Commons licensed track, so you can download the whole audiobook in a nice deep voice that doesn't sound like Arnold, and listen to it. I just put a few minutes down in these few paragraphs that really sum up the question. It's from chapter 7, which is on the eternal revolutions, from which we have already heard today. But it starts with Darwinism cannot lead to any meaningful philosophy. This is not Darwinism as a biological theory considered here, but because it's of the idea of progress, and he talks about people who think that by just leaving time running, things will get better, as was a view in his time. He then says, well, just by this evolutionary principle, things are not necessarily getting better. So I hope you really enjoy I wouldn't be able to summarize it in a better way than Chesterton himself, so I'm going to play this clip for you.
Darwinism can be used to back up two mad moralities, but it cannot be used to back up only the same one. The kinship and competition of all living creatures can be used as a reason for being insanely cruel or insanely sentimental, but not for a healthy love of animals. On the evolutionary basis, you may be inhumane, or you may be absurdly humane, but you cannot be human. That you and a tiger are one may be a reason for being tender to a tiger, or it may be a reason for being as cruel as the tiger. It is one way to train the tiger to imitate you, it is a shorter way to imitate the tiger. But in neither case does evolution tell you how to treat a tiger reasonably. That is, to admire his stripes while avoiding his claws. If you want to treat a tiger reasonably, you must go back to the Garden of Eden. For only the supernatural has taken a sane view of nature. The essence of all pantheism, evolutionism, and modern cosmic religion is really in this proposition that nature is our mother. Unfortunately, if you regard nature as a mother, you discover that she is a stepmother. The main point of Christianity was this, that nature is not our mother. Nature is our sister. We can be proud of her beauty, since we have the same father, but she has no authority over us. We have to admire, but not to imitate. This gives to the typically Christian pleasure in this earth a strange touch of likeness that is almost frivolity. Nature was a solemn mother to the worshippers of Isis and Cybele. Nature was a solemn mother to Wordsworth or Emerson. But nature is not solemn to Francis of Assisi or George Herbert. To St. Francis, nature is a sister, and even a younger sister, a little dancing sister, to be laughed at as well as loved. It is conceivable that we are going more and more to keep our hands off things, not to drive horses, not to pick flowers. We may eventually be bound not to disturb a man's mind even by arguing, not to disturb the sleep of birds even by coughing. The ultimate apotheosis would appear to be that of a man sitting quite still, not daring to stir for fear of disturbing a fly, nor to eat for fear of incommoding a microbe. To so crude a consummation as that, we might perhaps unconsciously drift. But do we want so crude a consummation? Similarly, we might unconsciously evolve along the opposite or Nietzschean line of development. Superman crushing Superman in one tower of tyrants till the universe is smashed up for fun. But do we want the universe smashed up for fun? Is it not quite clear that what we really hope for is one particular management and proposition of these two things? A certain amount of restraint and respect, a certain amount of energy and mastery. If our life is ever really as beautiful as a fairy tale, we shall have to remember that all the beauty of a fairy tale lies in this, that the prince has a wonder which just stops short of being fear. If he is afraid of the giant, there is an end of him. But also if he is not astonished at the giant, there is an end of the fairy tale. The whole point depends on his being at once humble enough to wonder and haughty enough to defy. So our attitude to the giant of the world must not merely be increasing delicacy or increasing contempt. It must be one particular proportion of the two, which is exactly right. We must have in us enough reverence for all things outside us to make us tread fearfully on the grass. We must also have enough disdain for all the things outside us to make us on due occasion spit at the stars. Yet these two things, if we are to be good or happy, must be combined, not in any combination, but in one particular combination. The perfect happiness of men on earth, if it ever comes, will not be a flat and solid thing, like the satisfaction of animals. It will be an exact and perilous balance, like that of a desperate romance. Man must have just enough faith in himself to have adventures and just enough doubt of himself to enjoy them.
Brilliant. Yes. The brilliance is this. I mean, the first aspect of brilliance is expressed by a very simple truth that we as Christians, of course, all knew all along, but it's beautifully expressed here through the eyes of St. Francis. For St. Francis, nature was not a mother. She was a sister. It's this realization that we as human beings are a creature, that everything else is a creature, that we are all from God. And therefore, while we are not, if we were from nature, we might have to bow down to nature, which gave birth to us. But we are from God, we have a common Father. The way we relate to the environment is not as children to a mother, but as to a sister. A dancing sister is beautifully expressed for St. Francis. This one that is to be admired and cherished. So the way we look at the environment can't be the one that is destructive. Our view of nature comes from our relationship to the Father. It's our relationship to the triune God, who is the creator of all things. And it's in this relationship to God, the Father, that our relationship among ourselves and to nature have the origin of their structure and their goodness and how they are to be lived. If we understand how we are related to God and therefore related to each other and to others, we realize that an exploitation of nature that is destructive is one that we cannot do for two reasons. We have the precept of charity. So when we, just to return to the example of our electronics, if we just close our eyes to the fact that we make life impossible to people in India or other people who take our trash, and it's not the people who take the trash, it's companies who make money with it and use the laws that don't exist there to just dispose of it in an unsanitary manner, and then people have no drinking water. So charity requires for us a view towards the environment that is our sister, that is to be cherished, and it has a value in itself as a creation. When you read the Church Fathers, it's always beautiful. And in fact, in the Gothic period, if you go to churches, you sometimes find animals depicted all over the place. They're called bestiaries, which sounds very beastly, but it's really just meaning a lot of beasts. And you know, one of these famous symbols of these bestiaries is the pelican, right? You sometimes find it in churches on the tabernacle or in vestments. You see a pelican opening his breast, and he has the young that take from his flesh and blood. This was believed to be the case by writers of antiquity because maybe the Dalmatian of all pelicans, the Dalmatian pelican, has red or pinkish breast feathers in the season of breeding. And for this reason, it was sometimes construed that he might, because then when you read, well, I'm not going to go into details of feeding habits of pelicans, but you know what happens. There's some regurgitation and things falling down. So there was the concept from afar that they are giving themselves to their young, which then of course became a symbol for Christ. So when you, and that's why it's depicted in the church. But the idea behind it is that everything in nature, everything in creation, because it comes from God, in some way speaks to the greatness of God, to the wonderful things that he devised. If you can't read the Psalms without getting this sense of wonder that Chesterton speaks about also in this passage. So this is something that we have to have. So the way of exploitation, or the way to ignore the fact that what we do and how we do it is exploitative, we cannot go as Christians. Not if we want to follow this balance that Chesterton proposes. The second thing is, against neo-pagan pantheism is not very difficult to grasp the concept, because a transcendent God is different from creation. So the relation we have, mean, even science in some ways is only possible if you have a transcendent God. Because if you believe that this tree is your mother in some way, or connected to your mother in a almost physical reality in pantheism, then you cannot open it up to see what's happening and how the processes work to understand it better and then do something else. Science only became possible in a civilization that worshipped a transcendent God, a God that went beyond this world and that could appreciate the creation, understand the creation, and as gardeners put into paradise, live according to the plan of God. So this is something that the neo-pantheist view is not viable for us. And therefore we have difficulties, ideological difficulties sometimes when we encounter environmentalists who are very much steeped in that. Sanity comes back in through this relationship to God, which turns nature from a mother into a sister. What helps with this is a sober perception of sin. This sentimental idea that man is fundamentally good will always create problems, because it is not real. And so this perception of sin, original sin, and knowing man as he really is, which the Christian view proposes, gives us a true perception on the problems, while not being you can be anti-humanitarian by saying, well, man then is not acting that way. You have to look at the individual and his relationship to grace, to sin, and all of this. Also from this view comes the conception that is foreign to the neo-pantheist, that man has an intrinsic value, even a special value, as a special creation of God. So, in short, when I have a lot of friends in the United States, and in the United States, environmentalism has become a bipartisan issue. You have one party being environmental, and the other party, for the most part, being considered at least to be anti-environmental, or not caring about certain things because it's about economy and so on and so forth, and it's these considerations that dictate and rule. And because there are ideological problems associated with the left, I find friends that are Catholic, even if science doesn't support it, they would share in social media and everywhere articles that support something that is anti-science, or that sort of is not directed at this, or tries to remove itself from its environmental movements for its ideological problems. But that's not the path we can go. We have to be fearful enough, or not be fearful enough to avoid treading on grass, while at the same time having this realization that we are not a foreign object to this world, but we are a creation from God in this world, and we have a purpose in this world. I believe that if we went into the environmental question from an economic perspective, that a lot of what we have already heard, what was touched on with the distributist idea, it would have great benefit on the way we relate to nature. You have a principle that is associated with it, which is small is beautiful. You have something that is closer knit to something local, to the resources and other things as well. There's a closer connection with everything around you, which can help in a perspective. But because it's not rooted in neo-pantheism, it doesn't become this romantic fantasy that some people propose even nowadays. But it is grounded in this deep truth of Christianity and the way we are as humans, having a sister, a dancing sister, a sister that is to be loved and admired, but not feared. Thank you. I'm sure you're all hungry, so...
Thank you, Father, for your lovely speech. We'll be taking questions now. Znači, pitanja još jednom, ako neko želi veličasno. Imamo li...
The answer is yes.
Yes.
But read Chesterton.
Nikola mi je tamo.
Kratko. What do you say about Laudato Si? Doesn't the Pope Laudato Si, the encyclical?
Laudato Si actually has an echo of Chesterton in the sense that it speaks of sister. It is of course also an echo of St. Francis, who uses sister, mother. It has it in its when you come to the actual questions of carbon and these questions, I would leave it to the scientists. But I also don't leave it to the ideologists in the sense that just because the science that I look at doesn't fit my ideology, I'm going to look for a scientist who does fit my ideology. I think that is also a problem that I at least find on the more conservative side of the debate. But I think Laudato Si has some very beautiful insights with respect to this particular issue on the sister nature.
I think Chesterton is better.
This is perfectly a valuable position to hold, as we are not obliged as Catholics to consider encyclicals necessarily better than Chesterton, because which encyclical really is.
Thank you. Ima još pitanja?
By the way, to just add to this, we find the same thought that is expressed in Laudato Si to some degree, not with respect to some of its conclusions, but with respect to the fundamental principle and idea. We find it also in Benedict XVI before. Yes, we have debate over lunch. I'm not going to debate because humility requests silence.
Of course.
And ignorance even more so.
Okay, nemojte biti sramežljivi, pitajte. Evo.
Very good. Let's go in peace to God and serve the Lord.
Ako nema pitanja. Ok, imamo jedno pitanje. Tamo, primijetio sam, Nikola. Daj čovjeku mikrofon.
I haven't heard much about beer cans in your presentation.
This is true. This has two reasons. Because beer cans, as I mentioned at the beginning, was just a way to formulate the question of recycling environmentalist. Recycling has been an environmentalist. That's why the word environmentalism got so big compared to beer cans. But if you want specifically to know something about beer cans, of course there is a lot to be said on beer cans. Partially it has to do with the fact that we can only assume what Chesterton would have said, because beer cans were invented in the year 1935, shortly before Chesterton's death. So in this respect, it is our hope as Christian people that he never went through the horror of actually seeing a beer can, because it might have been invented in a different part of the world. Because I do believe that something, when we already had this wonderful passage about drinking and rational drinking, I believe that someone who speaks about the consumption of alcohol with this festivity and this joy will obviously not recycle beer cans, because he would be against beer cans to begin with, because you have this drink of life, as you will, this drink of community and celebration and unity that is packed into something as lifeless as an aluminium can that comes from not a worker who put his heart and soul into it as he would into a mug, or he would put into a crafted glass. So I do believe that he would object to the concept of beer cans, and so that maybe answers the question.
That was beautifully said.
Oh, yes.
It was very Chestertonian, I might add. Any more questions? Nicola.
I have a short question. You mentioned the relationship to God. Can you do a little comment on our knowledge of God's true nature? Because in Summa, St. Thomas in his Summa Theologia says that when you're watching nature, when you are wandering at nature, you are receiving this, she communicates this sense of justice and gentleness. So can you a little bit say something about this, our knowing, the Bible is full of this, knowing God's true nature?
Well, I mean, when it comes to the question of how we know God, or even, I mean, we only really know God if we know Him as a triune God, and that's as a communion of love as He is. And there was only one who revealed this, and it was not nature, and couldn't be nature. It was the one who comes from the Father, who comes from the side of the Father. So it's Christ who reveals us the true nature of God, the Trinity. We would be able to know some things about God, the unity of God, the power of God, and other things through observing nature. And of course, there are some things that once we have revelation, you would have the so-called traces. You have these traces of the goodness and truth and being of God in creation that is shadowed. I mentioned it a little bit in as much as the bestiaries are an approach that goes in a similar direction. You look at something in nature, like the lion in his power shows the goodness of God. In fact, it is the belief of St. Thomas, but also of all other eminent theologians who would say that everything in some way mirrors, because it's created by God, mirrors the greatness and the goodness of God. So we could arrive at some things through looking at nature, but because nature is fallen with us, we wouldn't be able to gain everything we should know about it, or even get a clear picture about everything. So I think nature is best understood by someone who has understood redemption. And that's why the life of St. Francis by Chesterton is so beautiful in its description of man who is in his fallen nature has put gods everywhere in every tree and made gods of the woods and gods of the sea and gods of the sky. And there's almost, the church took a Benedict option in some way for the first millennium, a catharsis to remove itself from these images that were innocent, Chesterton says, in their beginning, but who were no longer innocent, because if they don't have the regulative perspective on God, they become something less than human. So when sex becomes divine, it becomes something less than what maybe some fancy of a poet in the antiquity could express truthfully in it. So in that sense, he speaks of this period of the church. It's the first chapter, so it's marvelous. Have you all read St. Francis of Assisi? You can go to confession afterwards. No, read it. The first chapter is so beautiful in the way it looks at history, and therefore you have this idea of this withdrawal from nature and not being able to talk about nature because it was tainted. And then he speaks of the new morning, the glorious new sunrise in which Francis is the first man who speaks of nature again as if there had been nothing before, in all its innocence and beauty, and it's just marvelous. Great. Yes. Read St. Francis.
I have a question.
One more question. You will go ahead.
Last before the lunch, maybe. So, if you have experience talking to these two kinds of people, neo-paganists and those who are for exploitation, to whom can you, to whom is a Catholic idea closer? Because, as I see it, these neo-paganists, they are wrong on a question, let's say, relationship between God and nature. They are wrong. Or these guys who are for exploitation, they are disinterested into the question. So I see it this way. So I'm always for those people who are wrong, and then more for those who are wrong than for those who are just not interested. For me, it seems like you can better approach to someone who is wrong than to someone who is, well, not interested in question about God and how is it connected with nature. And I think that maybe in our, let's say, most of the Catholics, I think they are trying to approach more to these people who are for exploitation, because they are maybe more on, let's say, social conservative side, and these other one are on the leftists, so they are, let's say, politically on the opposite side, so they are most of the time not even trying to approach this other side.
When there are two evils, it's not a question of which evil is best approached, it's which person who holds a wrong position is most approachable. If somebody is an ideologue and a material atheist, he can ruin the world, as Chesterton mentions, like Superman against Superman until the world burns. Hooray. You could maybe count in this camp that there's some self-preservation. So there's some remnant of, well, hopefully we're not dying in the process, so we have to curb it a little bit. While the other thing is fundamentally wrong also in this. But both get the relation that we have wrong. The ones because they worship the false God, and the other ones they worship no God, which is would speak of the Church Fathers, just some other demon. So in a way, you don't have to decide between the two. You have to proudly carry the torch with the light, the shining light that is illustrated so beautifully in St. Francis, but also beautifully, of course, in Chesterton, who wrote so marvelously about St. Francis in his work that you should all read. Now we should eat.
Okay. Thank you, Father, once again.